So from San Jose to Tel Aviv, and the Tel Aviv skyline is not the skyline that you would remember if you were in Tel Aviv 20 years ago, certainly before that. Tel Aviv skyline that you see today is the skyline of a modern high-tech city. I wouldn't say really industrial city. It's a lot more high-tech, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but you can see the Tel Aviv skyline. Also see the Tel Aviv railway line, or rather the railway line running through Tel Aviv, but Tel Aviv is in the process of building an underground local train network. And one of the things that Corona has been good for is that these guys have been able to get on with their job unaffected by other people. And so they're ahead of schedule for at least the first couple of lines of the city track. Now, the reason I'm starting by talking about this view of Tel Aviv and not, let's say, a seaside view, which we'll see a little bit later on, is because the two cities, Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, are maybe 45 minutes away from each other when there's no traffic. An hour and 15 minutes away from each other in sort of more normal time. They are two entirely different worlds. We spoke about Jerusalem, and today we'll focus on Tel Aviv. So here we have some people, again, maybe some familiar faces for some of you, people from your community that stood together in Tel Aviv. In this case, they're standing at the waterfront. We see behind them the Mediterranean Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea will be quite determinative of the atmosphere in Tel Aviv, of how Tel Aviv, the seaside city, it's a much more mellow city than Jerusalem. But let's go back to the beginning of the story to understand what happened. This is an image of Jaffa. Jaffa lies to the south of Tel Aviv, and in fact, you can see the north of Tel Aviv, or you can see, if you can see the cursor, hopefully, that's the hotel area, the north of Jaffa in Tel Aviv. For thousands of years, all that there was Jaffa. Jaffa, an ancient city, which is a city that today has been swallowed up by Tel Aviv. The official name of the city is Tel Aviv Jaffa. Nobody really relates to it like that. People understand Jaffa as a neighborhood of Tel Aviv. Old sandstone buildings. It's gone through an incredible gentrification. Big mistake I always say that I made, 30 odd years ago when I arrived in the country was to not buy 2 apartments in Jaffa. Why 2? Because 1, I would be living in the cool inn neighborhood, and 2, I would have sold the other one for an absolute fortune. Unfortunately, when I arrived in Israel, I didn't have enough money back then to buy even one. Or the foresight. Jaffa today is very, very very, very hot real estate. We can see view from the sea. Jaffa is mentioned in the Bible a few times, but not as an important place. Jaffa is the place through which things enter and leave. So when Solomon is building Jerusalem, and Solomon seeks to receive materials from Hiram of Tyre, so they come through Jaffa because Jaffa is the closest port to Jerusalem. And Jaffa is also the port from which Jonah leaves when he flees from God. So we see the statue today. Paradoxically, the statue is the statue of what looks to all of us as a whale. And why do I say paradoxically? Because Ilana Gur, the artist who made this, would have read her Bible in Hebrew. And in Hebrew, it tells us it was a big fish. There is a different word for whale. The fact that our limited imagination translators, decide to go to whale is one thing. Nevertheless, it is kind of symbolic. Jaffa, the whale, Jonah, that's the image that we have. Another image that you may have with Jaffa, another term that you associate with Jaffa, and for those who couldn't see, we can look a little closer on the oranges, is the sign Jaffa. Jaffa was synonymous with oranges. When I was growing up, people my age, a little bit younger and certainly older, that was synonymous with Israel. Jaffa orange. The fact is, they weren't oranges from Jaffa. The fact is, they were from the port of Jaffa. The crates were stamped Jaffa, like we have a product, made in whatever, or what goes through a certain port and it gets the stamp of that port. Jaffa was a small city surrounded, certainly, and we'll see some images in a moment, by sand dunes. It was not a suitable place really for oranges, but Jaffa oranges, and again, this is a relatively modern phenomenon. We know that oranges are not a species mentioned in the Bible. This was not a fruit that we're used to from the time of the Bible, but it becomes synonymous with Jaffa. I, a little while ago, asked my 14-year-old, and he had never heard of the association. He lives here. We eat oranges. So it's really not associated any longer, but once upon a time it was. It's so unassociated, or it's so much of a memory, that one of the places I love to walk around in the alleyways of Jaffa is that image of an orange tree. It's a living orange tree. It's a piece of art, an orange tree growing out of a suspended ball filled with soil, to which water and chemicals, fertilizer are brought, and it's a living orange tree. It gives blossoms at the right time. It gives fruit at the right time, but it's a little surreal, which is what the message really is, because Jaffa is now surrounded by urban Tel Aviv, and it's not an international import-export port. Either way, when we export, it probably goes through Ben Gurion, most of the fruit, and not through the airport and not through the seaport. But you see that symbolic orange tree. What we also see in Jaffa are a number of churches. And the church that you see here is the St. Peter's Church. Jaffa is not a holy city for the Jewish people. Like I say, Jaffa was a gateway. People left and goods came in through Jaffa, but nothing significant happened for the Jews. But a number of significant things happened for the Christians. And that's why we see this very prominent church standing right on the top of the hill in Jaffa, which is the St. Peter's Church. It is the Catholic Church, but there are a number of other churches commemorating an event where Peter, not Jesus, but Peter resurrects a woman called Tabitha. And after he's finished, a very significant moment happens. Christian-Jewish relations. He sits on the roof praying while they're making him lunch. And from the heavens, a tablecloth laden with animals comes down from the heaven, and a heavenly voice says, "Kill and eat." Peter looks up. All of the animals are not kosher. So he says, "I can't eat, it's not kosher." And the tablecloth goes back to heaven. It comes down a second time, and they repeat the story. And again, he says, "I can't eat, it's not kosher." And it goes back to heaven. It comes down a third time, and the heavenly voice says, "Kill and eat." And Peter says, "I can't eat, it's not kosher." And the heavenly voice says, "I made it, you can eat it." And that's the point, that Judaism and Christianity split on dietary laws. Until this moment, all Christians kept kosher. And interestingly, Peter leaves Jaffa and heads to Caesarea and converts the first pagan, a guy called Cornelius. Almost as if to say that, as long as they were kind of confined by this kosher law, the others weren't going to come in. But once this laws of kashrut were removed, the gateway to allowing many, many converts in would happen. So Christian groups that I would guide and groups that are not Jewish, Jaffa is an important site, less for the break with Judaism and more for the healing of Tabitha. But the break with Judaism is, of course, a significant event, and it happens here in Jaffa. Now, I've been talking about Jaffa, but what is Tel Aviv? So this is a picture taken of the beginning of Tel Aviv. April 1909, 111 years ago. It wasn't like today where we all have our cell phones and we take pictures of our lunch and take pictures of, of anything we see that's of interest during the day. This was a big deal. So what's going on in this picture? Firstly, the cameraman has Jaffa at his back. So when you look at the picture, there is nothing but sand dunes. Nothing but sand dunes, and not just sand dunes, but denuded sand dunes. There's hardly any plant life growing on the sand dunes. There are places today where we have sand dunes, but there are plants adjusted to life on sand dunes. On the other hand, these would have been removed by the goats that were in the area. What we can see in this picture is 66 families. The 66 families that gathered together to leave Jaffa and to build a new Jewish neighborhood outside of Jaffa. They could only afford this very poor land. They could only afford sand dunes. And even though they could agree on leaving Tel Aviv, or rather on leaving Jaffa and coming to create something new, which was to become Tel Aviv, they couldn't agree on who would get which lot. So what you can see are the families gathered around a boy with a bag of brown shells and a girl with a bag of white shells. On her shells were written the names of the families. On his shells were written the numbers of the plots. And this was the draw that decided which family got which piece of land. Now, I want to read to you, I hope it's clear to see just a few lines from the translation of the manifesto of these 66 families. Therefore, it is upon us to purchase a piece of land upon which to build our houses. The site needs to be in the vicinity of Jaffa. Remember, Jaffa is where their jobs are, through the port, import, export, hostels, those kinds of things. And it will be the first Hebrew city, in which 100% of the residents will be Hebrews, in which Hebrew will be spoken, in which cleanliness and purity will be maintained, in which things will not be done in a non-Jewish way. And as the city of New York symbolizes the main gate to America, so we must modernize our city and become the New York of the land of Israel. Sometimes when I'm with people in Tel Aviv, and they've come to Jerusalem or they've come to Israel with expectations, and they look at Tel Aviv and it's just like a city, and they say, it's just like New York. Well, from the get-go, that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to build a modern city. Now, initially, the city was called Achuzat Bayit. Name does not appear, and I think I should have written it because it's a strange and complicated name. Achuzat Bayit means a home and a freeholding, because they wanted this sort of semi-rural neighborhood that they were going to build semi-rural neighborhood that they were building outside of Jaffa. After 2 years, they changed the name. And they changed the name from Achuzat Bait, which is, by the way, a very difficult name for English speakers that are not South African. South Africans with a Germanic influence can do the English speakers from other countries struggle with that sound. It's not the reason they changed it. They changed it in honor of Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl wrote 2 books. Theodor Herzl, the founding father of the Zionist movement. His first book was called Der Judenstaat, State of the Jews. That was his political manifesto that kickstarts the Zionist movement. His second book was called Alt-Neuland, one long German word which means old, new land. In English, we would write that with hyphens. In Hebrew grammar, and this is of course before advertising, which allows you to break grammatical rules to sell products. In the early days, they couldn't translate Herzl's book because you couldn't put in Hebrew grammar 2 words that mean opposite things next to each other. You're not allowed to put old, new next to each other. Even with a hyphen. Hebrew grammar early does not allow that. So they gave it a symbolic name to Herzl's book. For old, he took the word Tel. Tel is an archaeological mound, layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of civilization. And Aviv, spring, season of renewal. They symbolically called Herzl's book Tel Aviv, the Hebrew translation of Herzl's book, which, as we know, was written in German. And that was the name that they give the city. And the symbol of the city is a lighthouse, even though they never really build one. And the city has 7 stars. You can see on the initial emblem of the city, 7 stars, because Herzl's initial idea of the Zionist flag was not going to be the blue star with the blue lines, but was going to be 7 golden stars on a white background, represent the 7 hours of the working day. Herzl went down to that level of resolution in terms of his vision of what kind of state was going to be here. This is the initial emblem of the city of Tel Aviv. As we'll see, Tel Aviv is very, very different to that kind of place in some ways, and maybe the same in others. Tel Aviv rises up out of the sand dunes. And what they are doing is literally moving the sand dunes with wheelbarrows. These people see themselves as new Jews. When one hears new, going back to the comment I made about advertising, new and improved. New is better than old. New York is better than old York, and New Amsterdam was better than old Amsterdam. The idea that new is better. They were going to be new Jews, not like those Jews in the diaspora. By the way, not like those Jews in Jerusalem. They were going to be new Jews who didn't depend on someone else to do their dirty work. We're going to move those wheelbarrows themselves. But the second thing these new Jews were going to do was to build, we see it in the 2 lower pictures, was to build a Hebrew high school. Because the new Jew would speak Hebrew. Now, remember that the European Zionists, their high admiration for Herzl, understand European nationalism. And nationalism in Europe is built around a specific people, has a specific language, a particular place. They did not want the people coming to the land of Israel, some to speak Yiddish, some to speak Ladino, some to speak Hungarian. If we wanted to be a nation, we needed to go back and breathe life back into our historical language. And so those two images, as different as they are, the image of the men pushing the wheelbarrows, the image of the Hebrew high school, are two sides of the same idea. We're building a new Jew here. And that new Jew will be someone who functions completely in Hebrew, not in another language. What we can see over here is the main street of Tel Aviv. It is already the 20s. And that main street of Tel Aviv is called Rothschild Boulevard. It's called Rothschild Boulevard because when these 66 families got together to buy some land, they realized they had enough money to buy the land, but they wouldn't have money to build their houses. So they went as a group of 66 and they said to the bank, will you give us a loan? And the bank said, what's your collateral? And they said, well, you can have our land. And the bank said, yeah, pile of sand dunes, no thanks. We'll give you the money if someone will guarantee your loan. It took them a few years, but eventually they found Rothschild, and Rothschild agreed to guarantee their loan. And as a result, the main boulevard of early Tel Aviv, named after Rothschild. Now, why was there a main boulevard to start with? 66 families. Why did they need, from the get-go, from day one, to have a boulevard? Because it was sand dunes. And when they smoothed the dunes out and they dumped all the sand into the gully, engineers said, we can't build there. That place is not going to be stable enough. So build the houses where you've moved the dunes, and where you dump the dunes, make a park. And that becomes Rothschild Boulevard. It is absolutely also Unter der Linde, the Champs-Élysées. Unter der Linde, the main tree-lined boulevard, much longer, much bigger, certainly at the time, through Berlin, or the Champs-Élysées in Paris. This is what these people are building. They're building New York, but they've never been to New York. So they're building a great Western European city. These Eastern European Jews are not aspiring to rebuild Eastern Europe in Tel Aviv. They want to build Western Europe. They want to build something quite different. And still there today. Rothschild Boulevard today, I always warn the people that are with me, this is one of the most dangerous places in Tel Aviv. It's dangerous because half of that boulevard is a cycle lane, and half of the boulevard is a pedestrian lane. And people who walk in the cycle lane walk there at great personal risk. But Rothschild Boulevard is absolutely still the center of Tel Aviv, and we'll refer back to it towards the end of our tour, because it's also important for another phenomenon in modern Tel Aviv. What else is Tel Aviv? What else is significant in Tel Aviv? Here we can see the construction, the opening ceremony. It's not yet finished. Construction of a theater in Tel Aviv. Now, there was a theater company that had been founded already in Europe, and the theater company was called Habima. The word may resonate with you because in the synagogue, in the temple, there is a bima. That is normally the place in which we read the Torah, from which we conduct the service. But bima means podium or stage. And this theater company, which aspired to do theater in Hebrew, named itself Habima, and later on they built a theater for it. And that is the modern Habima Theater, built on top of the original theater in the same place, one of many different theaters in Israel today. That's a theme. We go back to the Herzliya Gymnasium. The parents of the children who went to the gymnasium the high school, may have spoken Hebrew, but if they did, they spoke it with an accent. Their children, when they went to the theater, whether they were watching Chekhov, Shakespeare, or a play written by an Israeli playwright, would watch it in Hebrew. Hebrew theater is part of the revolution. Chana Rubina, woman whose image you see, who was the mother of Hebrew theater, saw it as a miracle that she was performing, whether it was Shakespeare or Chekhov or an Israeli play, in Hebrew. Make no mistake, in the United States, your capital may be Washington, but your cultural capital, your theater, would be New York. Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, but the focal point of theater, of movies, of television production, of all of those elements is absolutely Tel Aviv. And I'm sure that some of you in the last while, certainly with the before Corona, but certainly with Corona, have seen some of Fauda or Diesel or some of the Israeli productions that are now being bought up by other companies. All started off with this revolution of, we're going to do theater in Hebrew. Tel Aviv is also all about normality. Normality, it's not going to be layer upon layer of history. Tel Aviv, and here we can see, I love both of these images. I love these young men. I've never been able to work out, are they wearing their underwear, or is this what bathing suits looked like at the time? I don't know, but they're very proud of themselves standing on the beach. And we see the young woman sitting on the beach, and behind her, camels. Someone driving their camels. It was easy to drive them across the wet sand than the dry sand. We know that ourselves. If you're walking on the beach in the dry sand, you're going to sink in. If you walk in the wet sand, you've got more support. Someone who had brought stuff to Jaffa Port or from Jaffa Port, and we see that image. So the beach from the get-go has been an important part of the Tel Aviv story. Normality. And remember that built into Zionism, there is a paradox. Are we a nation to be a light to the nations? Or are we a nation just as if we're any other nation, a nation like any other nation? So Jerusalem aspires very much to the first line, be a light unto the nations. Tel Aviv was a much more practical, we want to be like everyone else. And we can see that they very much still are. As of today, people are allowed back on the beach. And we can see hotels. Those of you that have been in Tel Aviv will know that Tel Aviv is a holiday destination for European Jews. Not only Jews, but especially for European Jews. And a number of years ago, I was guiding a family trip, not from your temple, from California. And on day 10, we had a couple of hours and the kids all went down to the pool, and I didn't have a room in the hotel. So I went down to the pool as well, hang out there for a bit. We ran into a group of British kids their own age, and the two groups of kids started talking. The British kids had been to Israel 7 times. Never yet been to Masada. American kids had been in Israel once for 10 days, and they'd been to much, much longer checklist because it's a lot further to go. British family, 1 year they go to Jerusalem as their day trip, and the rest of the time they go to the beach. The next year they go to Haifa as their day trip, and the rest of the time they go to the beach. Israel is a place where French Jews, British Jews, Swiss Jews, German Jews come and vacation on the beach, and increasingly not only Jews come and hang out on Tel Aviv beach. And we'll talk about some of the populations that come and play on Tel Aviv beach in a few minutes. Of course, it's not only the beach. There are some, again, hopefully some familiar faces that are hanging out in the pool, because most Tel Aviv hotels would have pools. Only a handful of Jerusalem hotels would have pool. People don't typically vacation in Jerusalem. They go to Jerusalem in order to do a whole lot of things. People come to Tel Aviv, vacation. So, changing focus, we go now to a building from the 1920s. The building from the 1920s is an example of what we call eclectic architecture. Eclectic architecture, but also a very conscious or self-conscious idea to build Jewish buildings. What's a Jewish building? So they wanted to include Jewish elements. If you look up at the top over here, you can see the horns, like the top of a horned altar. If you look down on the bottom door over here, you can see a Magen David, a star. If you look in the middle over here, there is a date palm, Tzaddik Katamar, righteous as a date palm. None of these elements are necessary. They're decorative and they're important. And we see over here, it's more difficult to see, a menorah built into the metalwork on the balcony. A decorative element of a menorah, and the whole building looks like a Torah scroll with the two rolls on either end and the flat section in the middle. Now, it's contrived to an extent, or contrived. These people are making a statement. They're saying, we've come back and we make the rules. We've come back and we're going to build something that is Jewish, that's going to give Tel Aviv a Jewish flavor. This is something that I'm going to touch on a number of times on this tour. Tel Aviv is a secular city. There are religious people in Tel Aviv, as there are secular people in Jerusalem. Tel Aviv is a secular city. It is a very, very, very Jewish secular city. And we'll touch more on that in a minute. When we talk of architecture, Tel Aviv actually is a UNESCO World Heritage site. Because of these buildings that you can see, an example from the 1930s in the upper picture, and a reconstructed or restored example currently. This is a type of architecture that is called Bauhaus. Bauhaus was a part of the international school, a design school, German branch of the design school. It was international. There was a French branch, and there were branches in other parts of Europe as well. And their idea is to build functional buildings. Function determines form. Exactly the opposite of the building we just looked at, in which there were all these decorative elements that were not functional. You didn't need the menorah on the balcony. You didn't need the date palm running up the center of the building. You certainly didn't need the horns of the altar at the top of the building. These buildings were built to be functional. If we look at the top building, you can see windows, 3, 3, 3, and then you see the entranceway. That's to light up the stairway. You don't need electricity in the stairway. You're building a functional building. You don't need electricity in the stairway during the daytime. Why is there this roof over here if it's functional? To give shade, which the balcony gives on the next level, and the balcony gives on the next level. Why do you need shade? Because Tel Aviv is pre-air conditioning. Tel Aviv is a hot Middle Eastern city. In German Bauhaus, houses always had red tiled roofs, so the snow would roll off. Functional. It's about functional. It is clean cut buildings. And when Tel Aviv was awarded UNESCO World Heritage status, the mayor of Tel Aviv set up a committee that reviewed more than 5,000 Bauhaus buildings in Tel Aviv and determined which ones were in such a poor state of repair that they were going to get knocked down, which ones were going to be restored, which ones were going to be preserved, but perhaps with an additional floor added or with underground parking added or whatever, made functional, but still preserving the element. And of course, once that committee was established, they started looking at the eclectic buildings as well, which is why the building we looked at in the picture before also got preserved. It got preserved because Tel Aviv actually now pays a lot of attention to the buildings in the city. This is a building that were we on tour right now, we wouldn't be able to visit. And it's, again, one of the things about the Corona crisis is that a year of us not being able to visit this building, which is Independence Hall. Hopefully they will be finished the restoration by the time this crisis is over. Now, what is Independence Hall? Firstly, you will see this is a picture taken from Rothschild Boulevard, the same boulevard that we saw beforehand. And the statue of the man on the horse, he was one of those 66 people that we saw at that initial lottery to see who gets which piece of land. And this building that you see is where his piece of land was. His name is Meir Dizengoff. And Dizengoff becomes the first mayor of the city. And he's a very activist mayor. He gets on his horse and he rides around the town, which grows very quickly from just 66 families. And he rides around the town looking to sort out problems and to see what there is. Dizengoff is a very, very good mayor. Unfortunately, he never has any children. And he calls Tel Aviv his child. And he decides that he will give as a gift to his child his home, to be the city's first art gallery. Because remember, he wants to build a normal city. He wants to build Berlin or Paris or Vienna. And without an art gallery, what kind of city it is? And so his home gets converted in his lifetime into the building that you can see in the 1930s to become the art gallery of Tel Aviv. Now you'll notice that the building has very, very small windows, which is why this was the building selected in 1948 for Declaration of Independence. It was here that David Ben-Gurion declares the State of Israel. Now, just a little footnote for those who don't remember, why does Ben-Gurion declare the state in Tel Aviv? After all, the movement is called Zionism. Zion is Jerusalem. The answer is that Jerusalem is inaccessible. There is a siege on Jerusalem. The war of independence has already begun. And so this is the place that they use, this small public building with small windows, because they worry there might be an air raid or there might be an attack, is where Ben-Gurion declares independence. Now, when we toured Jerusalem, we spoke about the holy sites of Jerusalem. If you wanted an inkling of the holy site of Tel Aviv, I would say that this is the holy site. And I use the term holy here in quotation marks, but this is the high point site in Tel Aviv. This was the moment that the Zionist idea came to fruition, and that state was declared. And it was pretty run down, and it was going to be closed for 2 years for repairs, and most of that time has ended up, most things have been closed, so hopefully the time we get there again, it will be redone. There is another building, a rather inauspicious looking building from the outside, and from the inside, you can see it's a very, very large library in many languages, and also, some bedrooms and a living room and so on. This is the home of David Ben-Gurion. was his home in Tel Aviv. He later on had a home in Sde Boker, in a kibbutz down in the Negev, where he moved down to live later on. This museum is free to visit. It's kind of a sleepy site. People don't often even know it's there. It's on a street called Ben Gurion Street now, named after him. And the truth is there's not that much to see in the house itself. Down below, behind it, they have like a place where you can see a movie about Ben Gurion and learn a little bit more about Ben Gurion. If you want to really understand Tel Aviv's attitude to Ben Gurion, it's this statue on the beach. Okay, Ben Gurion famously or infamously used to do exercises. He used to stand on his head, was supposedly good for your health, he thought, and Tel Aviv has built a statue of Ben Gurion wearing shorts written in English. Ben Gurion, the Hebraist, Ben Gurion, the man who, although he could read and talk many, many languages, would not allow you to rise above a certain rank in the army or the civil service or to take a cabinet position if you kept your diaspora name. David Green became David Ben Gurion. Golda Meyerson became Golda Meir. Shimon Persky became Shimon Peres. We could go on, you get the point, and yet here I always wonder why they write Tel Aviv in English. In what? English and Hebrew? Spoke about how important the gymnasia was in early Tel Aviv. I don't think this is a disrespectful statue to Ben Gurion. I think it captures very much what Tel Aviv is. Tel Aviv is, as we saw in those earlier slides, normality. Ben Gurion's idea of normality, of the beach, of the swimming pool, and of some of the things we're still going to see. I see this. See that there have been some messages in the chat which I haven't been reading. Okay, so they're not questions. Are there any questions? Are there any questions that people have at this point before we continue? If you have a question, just unmute yourself and ask. Okay, so I'm not hearing anyone. We'll continue, and there'll be more time for questions at the end. So I could not get a good image of this mosaic, which is one of my favorite sites in Tel Aviv. I decided to include it anyway, even though it's not a good image. This is a piece of art done by someone called Nachum Gutman. Now, we spoke about Tel Aviv creating theater and creating schools, and artist. Nachum Gutman is an artist who, when they tear down the gymnasia in the 1960s, school still exists in a new building somewhere else. They put up a skyscraper, the first skyscraper in Tel Aviv. As one of the graduates of the gymnasia, they ask him to make a mosaic to commemorate early Tel Aviv. And it's got a few different sections. It's got a section that shows Jaffa, which we can't see, and it's got early Tel Aviv, which is the sand dunes and the yellowness that we can see and the people building. I want to focus just for a moment on the image that we see over here. And like I said, this is not a great slide. This is an image of the streetlight. And this is an image of people standing around in amazement, looking at the streetlight. Because from the beginning, Tel Aviv is a 24/7 city. From the beginning, there are lectures and performances and parties in Tel Aviv. That's the New York part of Tel Aviv that's been there since the very beginning. And he captures the men pushing wheelbarrows and the workers and the people on the beach and the other elements that we spoke about. I'm going to be relating to this element in Tel Aviv, which has been there from the beginning as we continue our tour. normality of Tel Aviv means that the city understands the asset that it has. The city has developed an area which was the northern Tel Aviv harbor that was not used for very long. It was used from the mid-30s into the 40s, and that was all, and lay in disrepair. The city of Tel Aviv decided to convert it into a recreational area. It's not really beach, it's waterfront. So today it's filled with restaurants and coffee shops and stores, a lovely place to walk, and there are places where the wooden surface is rolling like dunes where you can roller skate or skateboard. And it's in that public place that they have a public Shabbat service in the summer when we don't have COVID. It's classically Tel Aviv because it is a come as you are service. It is a everyone is welcome service. It is, one could almost call it an outreach service. Some of you attended that service with me. We've been to those services with at least some temple groups have been there from your temple, and we go. It's Shabbat in Jewish public space. We go back to the comment that I made before when I said Tel Aviv may be a secular city. It's a very Jewish city. I went Friday night service there once, not with group, to show some members of my family, and we went out for dinner afterwards. Now, some of you know me and some of you don't. I like to have Shabbat dinner with my family, and I like to have it at home. I'm a free-flowing modern guy, and sometimes that's not where I have Shabbat. We went to a restaurant after having been at the service, and when they brought us to a restaurant that I'd been to before, and those of you know in Israel, when you order, you get the breads and the salads and the things that come out before what you've ordered. And I'd eaten there on weekdays, and they brought pitot. On Friday night, they brought challah, because that's Tel Aviv. Secular, Jewish. Tel Aviv is also home to Israel's startup. Now, there are startups all over Israel. The multinationals that move to Israel and open an office, much more likely to open that office in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, Haifa. May open additional offices. The VCs, the venture capital funds, open offices in Tel Aviv. The city is also home to tens or hundreds of startups. Those blue dots that you see are startups just in central Tel Aviv. Now remember, Tel Aviv, downtown Tel Aviv, or original Tel Aviv, is a city of 500,000 people. It's not a big city. Surrounding Tel Aviv are a whole lot of additional cities that make it into an urban area of 2 million people, into which commute another 1 million people every day. The actual physical Tel Aviv is a very, very small area. It's an absolute ecosystem of startups. Israel, it turns out, is very good at making startups, not so good at building them to scale. Is it the impatience of the local people, of the local culture? Is it the fact that our market, 9 million people, so from day one, you have to be looking across the ocean at a bigger market, at an American market, or an English-speaking market? That's the fact. What's interesting is that Israelis sell their startups, and someone did an analysis of startups around the world being sold, and the different nature of the contracts in the clauses, almost all Israeli startups request to stay. You can buy the intellectual capital, you can buy the product. We want to stay in Tel Aviv. So that's why we find often big companies who got to Tel Aviv. Google got to Tel Aviv when they bought a startup. The people said, we don't want to go, we don't want to move. Do an R&D, we'll be your R&D, or we'll be a branch of your R&D here in Tel Aviv. And that's absolutely part of the Tel Aviv culture. Why do I say that so biblically? Because Tel Aviv itself is a startup. Because 110 years ago, a group of people bought a pile of sand dunes and said, we're going to build a city here, and it's going to be New York. I think that the cultural roots for what Tel Aviv has become are absolutely what we can see in the culture in Tel Aviv. Changing focus. Tel Aviv was a city that had no history. It was a new city. It was a city built upon the sand dunes. Of course, a city that's been here for 110 years now has a history. The monument that you can see at the top is a monument place, the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. And the monument is actually a series of stones that are not connected. They look like there is an earthquake there, because that's what it was in Israeli society. It was an earthquake in Israeli society. We're a country that likes to argue. We're a country that has 39 parties registered for our next election. We argue loudly. We didn't think we killed each other over it. That was, in some ways, a realization of that Lviv's going to be a normal city, maybe too harsh a realization. We're going to be that normal? We assassinate prime ministers? The stone at the bottom says, Kan b'makom hazeh, here at this place, nirtzach, Motzei Shabbat, was murdered on a Saturday night, and gives the date, which is the 4th of November, or Yud Aleph B'Cheshvan, it's both dates. Rosh Memshelet Yisrael v'Sar HaBitachon Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister and Minister of Defense Yitzhak Rabin, peace will be his legacy. You see the monument, you see beyond the monument there's a flag, and we're going to step down to the other side of the flag. And what you can see over here are little markers stuck onto the stone that show us exactly where everyone stood. So the circle down at the bottom over here is the murderer, that's Rabin, that's a security guard, that's a security guard, there's another one here, and so on. It's very, very intimate. It's very, very personal. Tel Aviv carries this legacy, and every year on the anniversary of his murder, of course not this last year because of Corona, but in all times there is in that same square commemoration, in addition to the public commemoration, a commemoration of Rabin's assassination. We're going to take a break. When we say we're going to take a break, I'm going to not talk. You're going to watch a short video. There's not much sound in the video. You can't go to Tel Aviv without going to the market. And we're just going to walk through the market and get a sense of the market. And I'll come back on it and I'll drink some tea in the meanwhile. So we got a glimpse of the market in Tel Aviv, a very, very colorful food market, and we'll be talking about food in just a moment. Tel Aviv is also a cycling city. Unlike Jerusalem, which is a city of hills, whether it's the Temple Mount, or whether it is Mount Herzl, or whether it is Mount Zion, Jerusalem is a city of mountains. Tel Aviv is a flat city, and many times we cycle. You can see myself and a group of people that did a cycling tour, and there are these renter bikes all over the city. Again, a lot of people, because it's crowded, because it's urban, and because the city has invested in cycle tracks, which are dangerous to walk on, as I mentioned before, Tel Aviv is that kind of city. A lot of young people will come in by train and then take a bicycle from the train and dock it somewhere near where they work, and in the afternoon take one back, and so on. That's the kind of way the city works. We spoke about Tel Aviv being the 24/7 city, and Tel Aviv has really been suffering in this Corona period because Tel Aviv is a restaurant city. There was a period of time when outdoor dining was allowed, which meant that many Tel Aviv places could resume their typical lifestyle, but Tel Aviv is a party scene. Tel Aviv is the place that young Israelis from all over the country, you want to go celebrate something, you go to Tel Aviv. And the population of Tel Aviv is overwhelmingly 20s. Because when you're in your 20s, you finish the army, you're at school, or you just finished school, you don't mind sharing a 4th floor walk up that you're paying half your salary for. Then when you meet the person you want to share the rest of your life with, you might not end up staying there, you might move out to the burbs. And that's absolutely a Tel Aviv phenomenon. So there's a young group there. It's a very party element. Some people stay, but you have to really be one of the successful startups to want it to make it and stay in Tel Aviv, because Tel Aviv, real estate in Tel Aviv is astronomical. This is one of my favorite pictures because Tel Aviv is a gastronomical site. The number of times that I did culinary tours, either as a one-day option or a half-day option within a bigger tour, but even groups will come to Israel for 10 days on a food and wine tour or a culture, food and wine tour, because of the absolute mixture of people that have come in from all these different cultures and brought their cuisines with them and brought the experimentation with them, and Israelis now have money. Not all of them and not enough, but there is more leisure money, certainly in Tel Aviv, than there once was, and people are happy to do it. This is a tray from a taster's tray, which is olives and various vegetables stuffed with cheese and pesto. I ate dinner before I came to teach, but I'm already feeling, before I came to tour, and I'm already feeling a little hungry. I couldn't do a slide without shakshuka. Shakshuka is eggs poached in a tomato paste base, often with peppers and onions and garlic and other vegetables in it. A lot of the hotels, they serve it as a breakfast food, but we eat it here as a food, whether it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Shakshuka was a Libyan food. It's now an Israeli food because the Libyan Jews brought it with them, and we all ended up eating it. And that is part of what has happened in Israel. The tourists, the immigrants have come in from wherever they have. When they've come in, they brought the different culinary traditions. This is a place called Sarona Market. Sarona Market, which was a hall built for food stalls. All kinds of food stalls where you could get even falafel. Lots of far more exotic things, boutique hamburgers and handmade ice cream and all kinds of different food, because dining is what people go out in Tel Aviv to eat. People come from around the world to Tel Aviv to eat, and the city, as I said before, the same as the city built walkways and bicycle trails and that boulevard in the near the water, so they've also made an effort to cultivate the culinary tradition. I spoke about how different populations have brought their food with their immigration to Israel. This store is called Mizrach Marav, which means east and west. But if you look, and again, the angle of this picture, this is my picture. It's in the middle of a crowded area. I couldn't get a better angle. It says Asian store. That's because lots of young Israelis, when they finish army, go traveling to Asia, and while they're there, they develop a taste for some Asian food. So there's some of the customers. Why was the shop set up? The shop was set up because Israel also has today immigrants, or at least residents from Asia. A significant proportion of the caregivers, be it for infirm, elderly, or disabled younger people, Filipinos. A large number of the people working in agriculture in Israel are no longer Palestinians, because there were all kinds of security issues connected to the Palestinians. They're Thais. And these people have come into Israel and brought with them their culinary traditions and their requirements for certain products in order to produce their food. And so those young Israelis that went traveling now can get those products because there is enough of a market in Israel. And so I know that in California, the Asian influence is taken for granted. But in Israel, it's a relatively new phenomenon. There were a handful of families of Vietnamese boat people that Menachem Begin allowed in as refugees, but it's a much, much larger phenomenon today. In fact, recently, I don't know, it must be 3-4 years ago, a Filipino domestic competed in the Israeli Idol song competition and won. And she won the program, and having won, she was invited to perform at weddings and bar mitzvahs. They wanted to deport her because she was in Israel on a caregiver visa, not in Israel on as a performer, because the public outcry was big enough and she was allowed to perform. But I bring that anecdote to give you a sense of how much more diverse Tel Aviv has become. And I say Tel Aviv because most of those people would choose to live in Tel Aviv and commute to work somewhere else, because Tel Aviv is cosmopolitan. Jerusalem doesn't feel cosmopolitan. I live in Modi'in. It's half an hour on the train from Tel Aviv. Man who cleaned our house before COVID was from Sri Lanka. He lived in Tel Aviv. He came to our neighborhood a couple of days a week and cleaned people's houses because it's much cheaper to live in Tel Aviv where he was living and much more cosmopolitan, but he could come and work half an hour away. And on that note, we see that Tel Aviv has a large and growing population of asylum seekers. These are not the foreign workers that I mentioned before. These are people who could enter Israel by foot. They didn't have to risk crossing Sinai and confronting ISIS. Sinai, that's less of a risk than drowning, crossing the Mediterranean to get to Europe. We are the only first world country that could be reached by foot. From Eritrea, from Sudan, from other places in Africa. And South Tel Aviv, one can now see groups of people lounging about, waiting for day work. You've got to, you need people, you come by, you offer them the job, they take the job, they come back. Some of them, of course, get permanent jobs. And many Israelis, especially once the Corona crisis struck and day jobs were not happening, these people were very vulnerable, were sending food packages and were going out their way to try and help them. On the other hand, the religious right sees them as a threat. They're not Jewish and they're going to undermine our country and so on. It's an issue. And in fact, we will get to and talk about graffiti in Tel Aviv in just a few minutes. We see this one, which is graffiti, but made of slides, made of tiles. We were all once refugees. Lanu hayinu itim. And it's a deliberate dig at the fact that Israel is a signator to the founding United Nations document on refugees. Why did Israel in the early 50s sign it? Because Israel remembered the 30s when no one would take us in, and Israel remembered the 40s after the war when it was still very difficult for Jewish refugees. So we signed it because in our mind refugees were Jewish. Now we face a modern reality where there are refugees who are not Jewish and very often not white. How do we as a society cope with them? I know that this was issue in the United States around the elections. It's an issue here. It's not an issue in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is a much more cosmopolitan city. The people that oppose the refugees are not normally the people who live next door to the refugees. They're people who live somewhere else, but that we know is a phenomenon not only here. So we're going to go into just a little bit of graffiti. I know some of you were with me on one of the most adventurous graffiti tours I ever had, where an angry man chased us and shouted at us. It's the only time it ever happened. Southern Tel Aviv is covered in graffiti. And the reason that it's covered in graffiti, not northern Tel Aviv, is because southern Tel Aviv, those buildings are all going to be knocked down and new buildings are going to be put up in their place. So the city turns a blind eye to people making graffiti on the building. You move to northern Tel Aviv, nice upscale buildings, and you cannot really get away with Tel Aviv, with graffiti northern Tel Aviv. So this is a graffiti. It will be familiar to some of you from Psalm 137, Im eshkechech Yerushalayim. If I forget thee, Jerusalem. And you can see that there's a second line which has been covered up. The second line over here has been covered up. So the person who went around with this stencil in hundreds of places did not have on the second line the line, let my right hand wither, which is the line as appears in Psalm 137. But what they had instead was, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, it's because of Tel Aviv. And someone was so upset by that they went around and painted out the second line, leaving it with the traditional idea, the name of the movement, Zionism, this longing for Zion, this longing for Jerusalem. There's another voice that says, I prefer normality. I don't need all that history. If I forget you, Jerusalem, it's because I'm having such a good time here in Tel Aviv. It's not only a good time in Tel Aviv. This is a piece of graffiti, excuse me, which is the oldest piece of graffiti in Tel Aviv. And the image that you can see over here is the photograph of Rabin's assassination. Was an amateur photographer on a roof videoing it. He didn't know he was going to see the assassination, but he actually catches it. And we all recognize this picture. It's an icon for us. It's been on the wall since shortly after his assassination in November 94, and it's still there. Although the graffiti in Tel Aviv has quite a high turnover because people are painting new things, this one has remained. However, I said before that Tel Aviv is very Jewish, even if it's secular. If you think about Talmud just for a minute, there's a line of Bible, and then there's a line of Mishnah commentating on the line of Bible. And then there's a few paragraphs of Gemara commentating on the Mishnah, and then there's Rashi commentating, so on. So this is a picture we all recognize, and it's a picture of murder. But written below it, and I put the blue arrow to show you where it is, it says, Mi yeh haba, who will be next? And the first time I saw it, I thought, is that talking about political violence? Then I realized that Hebrew is a gendered language. It's saying in feminine, who will be next? In feminine. Unfortunately, it's a comment on a phenomena that has taken route now during the shutdowns when people are confined at home, where men have murdered their wives or girlfriends. Israel has had more, the last year of the corona crisis, more women murdered or attempted murdered than at any other moment in its history. We talk about the price of the lockdown or the price of getting corona, but just yesterday, a mother of 4, 38-year-old woman was murdered, her husband. That's what this sign is about, and it's a dialogue. Because when you come by, you understand that there was a murder, and you understand that it was this, and then when you read it in the feminine, you understand what it's talking about. Here is my favorite piece of graffiti in Tel Aviv. I go back to the Talmudic layers. We have a sign over here. You can see it. It says, Mashtin al chokei hamigdar shelanu. Now, the first word, Hebrew, if you write a word, mashtin, you have to excuse me, but this is what it says, I urinate. With an N, a nun at the end, it's a masculine word. With a hey at the end, it's a feminine word, but then the nun gets short. It's not a long letter, it's a short letter. So this is a person that has written the word without it being gender specific. Now, I remember the arguments when I was a student and we started writing he, she on an essay rather than just he, him, her. It was kind of cutting edge student. This is very new in Hebrew. The person writes, urinate on our gender laws. The word, playing with the word, you have to stop and we'll takes you a moment to read it. That's a sense of Tel Aviv cutting edge, grappling with how you use a gendered language in a less gendered way. There is a big challenge. Then someone came along and wrote in blue underneath, because this is the Talmud. First generation makes a comment, the second generation comments on the first generation. They wrote while sitting or standing. So, I can't tell if you're a man or a woman from the way you're writing, but how are you peeing? Are you standing or are you sitting? So there are far cruder things in Tel Aviv, which of course I didn't bring, but I felt this one, a chance to learn a little bit about the Hebrew language. So I hope I didn't offend anyone with that, but it's a classic example of how Tel Aviv is cutting edge and how language is being used in Tel Aviv. Here is another one, also a stencil, many times all over Tel Aviv, not as many as if I forget the O Jerusalem, but many times with a quote from Leviticus, V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, actually from my bar mitzvah portion. But you look carefully, and this is a man, this one seems to also be a man with peyot, and he's wearing a kippah, and this one's wearing a hat. What? Thy neighbor as thyself. Tel Aviv has beaten Rio and Sydney as the gay-friendly tourist destination in the world. 3 times in the last 5 years. I don't know if it was held last year or this year, but the 3 years before then, it won the gay-friendly tourist destination. Now, maybe it's because a lot of Europeans vote, and it's a lot cheaper to fly to Tel Aviv than to fly the whole way to Rio or Sydney. But nevertheless, Tel Aviv has one of the biggest gay pride marches. 500,000 people come to the Tel Aviv Pride March. We're a country of 9 million people. Now, most of them aren't even gay. It's just the best party in town. Tel Aviv is very much a live and let live city, and Tel Aviv has had gay members of the city committee, the city municipal council for many, many years. Jerusalem has a pride march as well. In Jerusalem's pride march, it's very, very political. They need almost as many police as marchers to protect marches. Very, very different atmosphere between the two places. Now, as I said at the beginning, in Tel Aviv, we don't see that much. We more experience, we feel, we get a touch of the city, but we can't end our visit in Tel Aviv without at least talking about some of the great museums in Tel Aviv. In addition to the Independence Hall, which is a historical site and not really a museum, there are a number of marvelous museums in Tel Aviv. There is the Beit HaTfutzot Museum, which is the Museum of the Diaspora, of the Museum of the Jewish Peoplehood. It's been rebranded. There's the Eretz Yisrael Museum, which is a museum of history and archaeology and art of the land of Israel. And there is the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, which is a spectacular building in and of itself. You can see the building, but which also houses really a lot of art and a lot of very avant-garde art. I'm going to take you to my favorite piece, just one piece. We don't have a lot of time in the collection, which is not very avant-garde at all. It's very cutting edge. Because before Marc Chagall was Moritzi Gottlieb. Moritzi Gottlieb, who lived from 1856 to 1879, died a very, very young man, was the first great Jewish artist. And he painted Jewish life, images from Jewish life in Eastern Europe, Galicia. This is a picture from 1878. It's the year before he dies. It's called Yom Kippur. There are 12 women in the picture and only 9 men. Does that mean there are other men that we can't see, so they had a minyan? Does that mean there were only 9 men in the synagogue? They definitely weren't counting the women. Even if he was cutting edge, it was not yet that kind of synagogue. Moritzi Gottlieb's famous painting, Yom Kippur, he himself appears 3 times in the picture as 3 of the men, as a child, as an older man, and well, as a young man and as sort of an older child. The piece, of course, these pieces were not pieces that were originally in Israel, were collected and brought to Israel. And I go back to what I said before, Tel Aviv might be a secular city. It's a very, very Jewish city. And this piece of art is one of the must-see sites in that museum. I'm going to move over now to a very, very different museum. This is the Shimon Peres Museum of Innovation. It is a cutting-edge museum which talks about why Israel has all of those startups. We go back to, and we saw earlier on in our presentation. Why does Israel have the startups? Where does it come from? It talks about the structural things that we have, the fact that our government gives loans, very low interest, to a handful of very successful startups every year that get through a selection process. It talks about the fact that when you leave our military, intellectual property is yours. In other words, you can't use it to build a missile, but if there's a civilian application to the radar you were using, you have to pay anyone to use that. And so you can make a product out of it and do something with it. There's the fact that failure is very acceptable in Israel. And there's the fact that, I mean, we keep electing a prime minister that's failed. So that just shows you how acceptable failure is here. It was a joke. Just a lot about him failing with the corona crisis right now. The other thing is the informality of Israel. The fact that there's this thing that all Jews are only 6 levels of connection away from each other. So all Israelis are only 3 levels away from each other, and everyone in Tel Aviv, you phone one other person and they've got the phone number of whoever you need. It's that kind of a place. And Shimon Peres Center for Peace and Innovation, which is, once again, back in Jaffa. So we started our tour earlier on in Jaffa, which is where the story of Tel Aviv begins. And we end our story in Tel Aviv at the Paris Center for Peace and Innovation, Jaffa, and for innovation, because we saw, and we're standing with our back to the sea and looking at the building. We're going to turn around. Big. That's what one sees when one stands at the Paris Museum and looks out onto the beach, onto the Mediterranean Sea. There's no doubt that this is appealing to everyone. Dream big. What's interesting, and we know that because we visited the gymnasia, and we spoke about how important Hebrew was, that Dafka, this sign, is in English, not in Hebrew. Is it because it's appealing to an international market? Is it because we're dreaming bigger than this little country? Now, Jerusalem has a lot of English. Jerusalem has a very, very, as we saw 2 weeks ago, a very, very different emphasis. So I'm going to see if I can see anything in the chat. So if there are any questions about anything I said, there's a new message that came in. Let's see. So anyone with a question, unmute yourself and ask the question. I'm going to close the share so that I can see more faces as well. Please.
Can you talk a little bit more about the treatment, if you will, or the legal status, if you will, of gays in Israel society?
Sure. So we have in Israel a government minister in Netanyahu's government, which is in coalition with the ultra-Orthodox, who is gay. We have the heads of some of the other parties contesting the current election, heads or prominent people who are gay. And we have a law guaranteeing rights to employment rights to gay people. The case that made its way through the Supreme Court was an El Al flight attendant who was getting all the miles and perks that a flight attendant was getting, but his partner of 20-something years, he wasn't married to, wasn't getting the perks of a partner. He went to court and he got them retroactively. And there are certain legal moments. Unfortunately, in Israel, there is no civil wedding at all. You can't have a civil wedding in Israel. You can only have an Orthodox Jewish wedding or a religious Muslim wedding or a religious Christian wedding. If you have a civil wedding outside of Israel, if you get married in Cyprus, when Israelis fly across, it's an hour, get married and come back for the party. Or you get married by an Elvis impersonator in Las Vegas, or you get married by a Reform rabbi in the US. Even if the person you're marrying is of the same gender, if you come into Israel legally married, or marriage is recognized. It's interesting because I guided a LGBT group, or a group that had it was a group of progressive activists that had a significant number of LGBT people in it, and they met with some Israelis and discussed the different things. And I would say that it seems like it's uneven in both places. So, for example, in Israel, when we get a mortgage, you can get someone should mute themselves. You can get a mortgage, a young couple's mortgage, which means part of your mortgage is at a better rate than the rest of the mortgage the first time you make a purchase as a young couple. You can also get a single mother mortgage at a good rate if you're a single mother. So, so lesbian couples, if they've had children, can actually get better mortgages than straight couples, because of the single mother deal is better than the married deal. But to gay men, if they were to have, for example, surrogate child, very complicated in Israel to have a surrogate, for two men to get a surrogate to give birth to them. It's the number of hoops they need to jump through to that to happen are very, very difficult. But again, if they have a surrogate out the country, they can come into the country with the child that's been adopted. So it's there's a long way to go, but it's also come a long way in Israel. We have two parties that are homophobic in their platforms running in the current election. One is a radical right-wing Kahana-type Jewish party, and one is an Islamist Muslim party. They have that in common. There are also a number of ultra-Orthodox parties that are anti-gay, but it's not kind of a central platform of their what they're going to run on, and they've managed to make their peace with Netanyahu. They're in the coalition with Netanyahu, who has a foreign minister who is gay. I also think it depends on where you are. It's much, which I know geography is something in the United States as well. I know that if you were a gay person in San Francisco, it's much better than in rural Wyoming. Israel's a much, much smaller country, but Tel Aviv is gay friendly. The rainbow flags on many businesses and so on. Jerusalem is not a very friendly place. There are gay people I know in Jerusalem, but it's a much more politicized idea. Where I live, it's the suburbs. So unless you're living in a family kind of structure, which some gay people are, more and more are, but historically where I lived, there weren't that many gay people, adults. There were, of course, gay kids grappling with how to be gay in the burbs. In my son's school, I think it would be handled very well. I think it would be a lot of support. In my nephews who are in an Orthodox school, I think it would be handled very differently. So very partial answer, but hopefully some light on that. Any other question or comment? Okay, so I saw the rabbi. Is he here? Rabbi, are you here? At one point I saw him. Okay, so folks, in 2 weeks' time, we will go to the Galilee together and visit, again, very, very different, very, very different landscape and stories to the stories that we've been exploring today. So there's a question of, is there a book that I can recommend, religious influences in Israel? Let me think, and I will definitely give you an answer in 2 weeks' time. Who asked that? Someone asked me that. Jeffrey asked me that question. So,
thank you.
I mean, there are books. I just want to think about it for a minute and not just throw out the first book that comes to mind. Also, I'm not sure what I've read in English and what I've read in Hebrew. There's a lot of material on it because it's a major, major challenge that we face. And even just maybe to end on that note, 93% secular over 60s have at least received one vaccination, and most of them already received their second. In ultra-Orthodox sectors, it's not even 60%. So it's not just now, and that's including the 10% that have been ill, that have actually had COVID already, or the 15%. Don't quote me on the exact numbers, but those are ballpark scales. So this is, this means that we're not going to reach herd immunity because there are people who are not going to get vaccinated, and there's no shortage here. You can go get vaccinated. They opened it up. Anyone over 16 can go get vaccinated in Israel today. You have to make an appointment. You can't just walk in, but if you were over 60, you would get a priority. So the issue of the tension between the ultra-Orthodox and the secular is not only on something as overt as gay rights. It's on something as basic as public health. And on that very note, I will wish you all a good day and look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time.